The night had already settled heavy upon the quiet town when John Cena's car rolled down the narrow street that led to his parents' house. The echoes of the roaring crowd from the wrestling event still lingered in his ears, a dull reminder of the bright lights and deafening cheers they had left behind just 2 hours ago. But here, everything felt different. Hushed, almost too quiet, as though the whole place held its breath. Beside him in the passenger seat, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson leaned back, arms folded across his broad chest, his eyes scanning the neighborhood through the window. They had driven nearly 2 hours from the arena, leaving behind the glamour and chaos of the wrestling world. What awaited them now was something John had been looking forward to for weeks, a night of peace under his parents' roof, a return to the simplicity of home. John slowed the car as they approached the familiar driveway. The house looked the same as always, white siding, a porch light glowing faintly like a beacon, and flower beds his mother tended even in the fall. It was comforting, but next door, in the shadows of the neighboring house, something caught Dwayne's eye. "Hey," Dwayne muttered, tilting his head toward the window. "You see that?" John glanced over. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, behind the thin curtain of a second-story window, he noticed her, a little girl standing still, her small face pressed close to the glass. She wasn't moving, wasn't smiling, wasn't even blinking much. She just stared at them with hollow eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "That's Ellie," John said after a moment, recognition dawning in his voice. "The neighbor's daughter." "She doesn't look too happy to see us," Dwayne noted, his voice quiet but weighted with concern. John shrugged, trying to brush it off, though something in his chest tightened. "I used to see her all the time when I came home. Sweet kid, always running around the yard, laughing, talking everyone's ear off. My mom would bake cookies, and Ellie would bring some over. She was full of life." Dwayne looked back at the window. The girl hadn't moved. Her eyes seemed empty, hollow in a way that made his skin prickle. He lifted his hand and gave a small wave, flashing his most disarming smile. Most children would at least wave back, shy or not. But Ellie didn't react. Her expression didn't change. "John," Dwayne said, lowering his hand slowly. "That's not right." "It's late," John replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe she's tired, or maybe she doesn't even recognize me right away." "No," Dwayne shook his head firmly. "I've seen kids in rough situations before. They look through you like they want to speak, but can't. That's exactly what I'm seeing right now." John pulled the car into the driveway, killed the engine, and the two men stepped out into the night air. It was cooler here, carrying the faint smell of damp leaves and something else, something that felt wrong. John reached for the bags in the back, but his mind kept drifting to Ellie's face in the window. He remembered the way she used to greet him, bouncing with excitement whenever he came home. The contrast gnawed at him. "You said your mom mentioned something?" Dwayne asked, slinging his own bag over his shoulder. "Yeah," John admitted reluctantly. "She told me once over the phone that Ellie hadn't been herself lately. Quieter. She said it worried her. I figure kids change, right? They get older. I didn't think too much of it." Dwayne set his bag down and turned to John, his expression serious. "And now you see her standing there like a ghost, not even flinching when I wave. You really think that's just her getting older?" John didn't answer right away. The image of the laughing girl he used to know clashed violently with the one in the window. A pit formed in his stomach. Something was very wrong here. Dwayne softened his tone, but not his resolve. "Look, man, we're already here. We don't have to make a scene. Let's just stop by, say hello. I'm the new guy in town, right? It makes sense, a friendly neighborly visit." John exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. He hated to admit it, but Dwayne was right. His mother's concern, Ellie's silence, the emptiness in her eyes. It all pointed to something being terribly wrong. "All right," John said finally. "We'll check in. But if everything's fine, you owe me an apology for being paranoid." "If everything's fine," Dwayne replied, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he already knew it wouldn't be. "I'll gladly take it." The two of them started up the steps to John's parents' porch, but John's gaze slid once more to the neighboring house. The curtain had shifted slightly, and Ellie was gone from the window. The light in her room flickered out, leaving nothing but darkness. The quiet of the town pressed in heavier now, and in sense of unease, followed them toward the front door. Whatever they were about to discover next door, John knew their peaceful night at home was already over before it had begun. John hesitated at the edge of his parents' porch, his gaze fixed on the darkened window of the house next door. The conversation with Dwayne replayed in his mind, his mother's subtle warnings, Ellie's empty stare, the silence that had hung too heavily for comfort. Dwayne set his bag down and folded his arms, waiting. The night air carried an unusual stillness, as if even the wind was holding its breath. "You know I'm right," Dwayne finally said, his voice cutting through John's internal debate. John rubbed a hand over his face, then let out a resigned sigh. "Fine, we'll go. But we keep it casual. Understood? No assumptions, no accusations, just a hello." Dwayne's lips curved into a grim smile. "Casual is my specialty. Let's go." They walked down the steps and crossed the patch of grass separating the two houses. The closer they got, the more John felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest. He had grown up seeing this house, watching Ellie play in its yard. It had always seemed warm, ordinary. Tonight, it felt unwelcoming, as though the walls themselves wanted to keep secrets. John knocked lightly on the door. Silence followed. He knocked again, firmer this time. The latch clicked, and slowly the door creaked open. Ellie stood there, small and fragile in the doorway. She looked even thinner up close, her dark eyes hollow, her clothes hanging loose on her frame, like they belonged to someone else. "Hey, Ellie," John said, forcing warmth into his voice. "It's been a while, huh? Do you remember me?" The girl's lips parted, but no smile came. "Hi," she said softly, almost mechanically, as if the word had been practiced, but held no meaning. Dwayne crouched slightly so he was closer to her eye level. His tone was gentle, careful. "Hey there, I'm Dwayne, a friend of John's. Just wanted to meet the neighbors." Ellie's eyes flicked to him, then back down to the floor. She shifted uncomfortably, tugging at the sleeve of her sweater. For a brief second, the fabric slipped enough to reveal a dark bruise along her forearm. She quickly adjusted her sleeve, but not before both men saw it. John's chest tightened. He forced himself to stay composed, even as alarm bells rang in his head. "Is your mom home?" he asked carefully. Ellie hesitated, then shook her head. Her voice was quiet, nearly lost in the air. "No." From deeper inside the house came a harsh male voice, loud and commanding. "Ellie, who is it? I told you not to keep the door open." The girl flinched visibly at the sound. Heavy, uneven footsteps approached from within the house. Then a man appeared, filling the doorway behind her. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements jittery. The smell of alcohol and stale smoke clung to him like a second skin. "What do you want?" he barked, his voice edged with hostility and suspicion. John straightened his shoulders, keeping his expression calm despite the tension coiling in his muscles. "Just dropping by. I grew up next door, and my friend's in town. Thought we'd say hello." The man's gaze flicked suspiciously between them, taking in their size, their confident postures. "Well, you said it. Goodbye." He reached forward as if to shut the door. That was when Ellie did something that made John's heart lurch. Almost imperceptibly, she lifted her hand behind her back, her fingers curled into a fist, her thumb tucked inside, a silent signal of distress that John recognized from his work with children's charities. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just neglect. This was a child in immediate danger, and she was begging for help in the only way she could. Dwayne's jaw tightened as he caught the gesture, too. "Actually," he said lightly, though his voice carried a subtle edge, "we just wanted to see how you're all doing. No need to rush us off." "Yeah, well, we don't need visitors, so leave." The man sneered. He tried to push the door closed, but John's foot pressed against the frame before it could slam shut. His eyes locked on the man's with unwavering intensity. "Wait," John said firmly. "I want to talk to Ellie for a minute." The man's face hardened, his jaw tightening with barely controlled rage. "She's busy, and she doesn't need to talk to strangers." "I'm not a stranger," John countered, his voice calm but unyielding. She knows me. I used to play catch with her in the yard. Times change, the man snapped, his hand twitching on the door handle. But Dwayne shifted closer, his towering frame casting a shadow across the threshold. The man's bravado faltered slightly in the face of Dwayne's imposing presence. John looked at Ellie again, his voice gentle but urgent. She stood frozen, her wide eyes darting between the adults, but she didn't deny anything. She didn't say she was fine. She only held her arms tightly against herself, shoulders hunched like a cornered animal preparing for another blow. Ellie, John said softly, speaking past the man's growing anger. Are you okay? She's fine. The man barked over him. Now get lost. But Ellie didn't answer the question. Instead, the slightest shake of her head betrayed the truth, that her voice couldn't speak. It was barely perceptible, but it was enough. Dwayne's expression changed completely. All traces of neighborly courtesy vanished, replaced by something cold and dangerous. His voice was low, controlled, but carried a quiet authority that cut through the man's bravado like a blade. If she's fine, Dwayne said, each word measured and deliberate. Why don't you let her say it herself? The tension at the doorway thickened until it was almost unbearable. The man's bloodshot eyes glared at John, his grip white-knuckled on the edge of the door. Behind him, Ellie stood small and trembling, her wide eyes darting between the adults as though searching for an escape from a nightmare that had become her daily reality. The night was quiet around them, but inside the house, the air was thick with something rotten, secrets that had festered too long in darkness. John's voice was steady, even though his heart hammered against his ribs. Ellie, why don't you step outside for just a moment? We'll bring you right back. The man barked out a harsh laugh that held no humor. Not happening. She doesn't need strangers dragging her into their business. She's fine where she is. Dwayne stepped forward, his massive frame filling the entryway. His calmness was gone, replaced by something hard and unyielding. Funny thing, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I don't see a fine little girl. I see a child with bruises and fear in her eyes. And I don't care who you are. She's not staying here if she doesn't want to. The man's face contorted with rage and panic. Back off, he snarled, shoving at the door with sudden, desperate force. John braced his shoulder against it, refusing to budge. Behind the man, Ellie whimpered softly. It was barely audible, but it cut through everything else like a cry for help that had been building for months. Ellie, John said gently, ignoring the man's increasing agitation. Do you want to come with us? You don't have to stay here tonight. The girl looked at him, her lips trembling, her eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for far too long. For a moment, she seemed frozen between hope and terror. Then, slowly, she nodded. That single gesture was the breaking point. The man lunged forward, trying to yank Ellie back into the house, but Dwayne moved faster. His hand shot out, gripping the man by the front of his shirt and slamming him against the wall inside the doorway. The man gasped, startled by the sheer force holding him in place. You lay one more finger on her, Dwayne growled, his face inches from the man's, and you'll regret it. John seized the moment. He reached for Ellie's hand and gently pulled her forward, stepping back onto the porch with her clinging to him. Her body shook, her small fingers digging into his palm like she was holding onto the last lifeline she had. The man thrashed under Dwayne's grip, shouting curses and threats, but the wrestler's strength was immovable. You can't just take her, he spat. She's mine. She's not property. John shot back, his voice filled with disgust. She's a child, and she just told me she wants to leave. The shouting had drawn attention. A curtain twitched at the house across the street, and a porch light flicked on. A couple of neighbors peered out, whispering nervously to each other, but none of them moved closer. Their fear kept them rooted behind glass and locked doors. The man noticed the growing audience, too, and panic flickered in his bloodshot eyes. He lowered his voice to a hiss. You don't know what you're getting into. Mind your own business. But Dwayne only pressed him harder against the wall. This is our business now. John crouched slightly to Ellie's level. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, but she clung to him with a desperation that tore at his heart. We've got you, he said softly. You're safe now. Don't leave me, she whispered, barely audible over the confrontation behind him. I won't, he promised without hesitation. Not ever. The man managed to wrench free from Dwayne's grip, stumbling back into the house. His chest heaved, his words tumbling out like venom. You think you're heroes? You don't know the first thing about this situation. She's mine, and you can't take her. The law's on my side. John's jaw clenched, but his voice remained firm and controlled. Not when the truth comes out. Ellie flinched at the man's words, the familiar threats clearly triggering memories of previous punishments. But then, for the first time since they'd arrived, she stood a little straighter. She shifted behind John, still clutching his arm, but her eyes met the man's with something new burning in them: anger. Neighbors were gathering now, though still at a distance, murmuring among themselves and pointing. The man realized that the eyes of the street were turning toward him, and it made him more erratic, more desperate. You don't know anything about us, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Her mother Dash, he cut himself off suddenly, his lips tightening as though he had revealed too much. Her mother what? John demanded, sensing something crucial in the man's slip. The man's face twisted with rage, and something else, guilt. None of your damn business. But Ellie's small, broken voice carried over his anger, clear and devastating. He hurt her, she said, her words trembling but growing stronger. He hurt Mom all the time. The world seemed to stop. John's breath caught, Dwayne's fists tightened, and the neighbors' whispers rose in alarm. This wasn't just about one child's abuse. There was something much darker here. The man spun on Ellie, his rage boiling over. Shut up, he roared, taking a threatening step toward her. But before he could reach her, Dwayne was there again, blocking his path like an unmovable wall. No, he said coldly. You're done. The man's chest heaved, his wild eyes darting around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. His mask had cracked completely, and the truth was bleeding out for everyone to see. John pulled out his phone with his free hand, his voice steady and final. I'm calling the police. The night air pulsed with tension as distant sirens grew louder, cutting through the suburban quiet like a blade. John kept one arm around Ellie, shielding her as though she were made of fragile glass. She clung tightly to his shirt, trembling with every breath, but there was something different in her eyes now, a flicker of hope burning beneath the fear. The man paced inside the doorway like a cornered animal, muttering curses under his breath. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. You don't know what you're doing, he spat, glaring at John and Dwayne. This is my house, my kid. You've got no right. Dwayne stood planted in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking any attempt at escape. His voice was steady, cold as stone. You lost that right the second you laid a hand on her. The neighbors' whispers carried through the street like wildfire. Curtains twitched, and more porch lights clicked on one by one. A few people had stepped outside, their faces pale but curious, watching as years of hidden abuse finally erupted into the open. The man's head jerked toward them, his paranoia sparking into fury. Nosy bastards, he growled, always sticking their noses where they don't belong. John ignored his ravings. He crouched down to Ellie's level again, his voice soft but urgent. Ellie, you don't have to be afraid anymore. If there's something you need to tell us, now's the time. We'll stand with you. Ellie's lips trembled. She looked from John to Dwayne, then back to the man who had controlled her life through fear and violence. Her voice came out as little more than a whisper, but it carried enough weight to silence the entire street. He hurt Mom all the time, she said, each word a small act of courage. He hit her. He yelled at her. He made her cry every night. The man froze, his face twisting with rage and panic. She's lying, he bellowed, but his voice cracked with desperation. That woman was weak. She couldn't handle life. She didn't kill herself. Ellie cut in suddenly, her small voice rising louder than before, fueled by months of suppressed truth. You made her. You hurt her until she couldn't take it anymore. Gasps rippled through the watching neighbors. John felt his throat tighten as the full horror of the situation became clear. This wasn't just ongoing abuse. This was about a woman who had died under circumstances that had never been properly investigated. "You shut your mouth," the man roared, lunging forward with desperate fury. But before he could take a step, Dwayne's arm shot out, shoving him hard against the door frame. The impact made the man's head snap back, and he staggered, pinned under Dwayne's unrelenting grip. "Try it," Dwayne warned, his voice vibrating with controlled fury. "I dare you." Red and blue lights suddenly washed across the street as two police cruisers pulled up, their sirens cutting out but leaving the night filled with flashing emergency beacons. Four officers climbed out, hands resting on their belts, their expressions sharp as they took in the scene. A hulking wrestler restraining an agitated man, John Cena protectively holding a terrified child, and neighbors clustered in tense silence. "What's going on here?" the lead officer demanded, stepping forward with authority. John's voice rang out firm and clear. "This girl is in danger. Her name's Ellie. She signaled for help and told us he's been abusing her. She just revealed he's responsible for her mother's death." The man thrashed under Dwayne's hold, his voice shrill with panic. "They're lying. She's my daughter. You can't believe some kid over me." "She's not your property," Dwayne snapped, tightening his grip. "And after what she just told us, you're lucky the police got here first." The officers exchanged glances, their training kicking in as they assessed the situation. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, crouched down to Ellie's level. "Ellie, is that true?" she asked softly. "Has he been hurting you?" Ellie hesitated, her small chest rising and falling quickly. Years of threats and intimidation warred with her desperate need to finally tell the truth. Her eyes darted to John, who gave her a reassuring nod. She drew a shaky breath and spoke, her voice steadier now than it had been all night. "Yes," she said. "He hit me. He wouldn't let me eat sometimes. He told me if I ever said anything, he'd hurt me worse." Her voice dropped to a whisper, but every word cut through the night air. "He did the same thing to Mom. He made her." She couldn't finish, but her meaning was unmistakable. The officer's jaw tightened as she absorbed the child's testimony. She stood and gave a sharp nod to her partner. "Cuff him." "Wait!" the man screamed, thrashing wildly against Dwayne's hold. "She's making it up. She's just a kid. You can't take her word over mine." But it was too late. Dwayne shoved him forward, and the officers snapped handcuffs around his wrists. The man's protests turned to snarls, then to panicked shouts as they dragged him toward the cruiser. "You'll regret this," he shouted at John and Dwayne, his voice breaking with desperation. "You don't know who you're dealing with. You can't just dash." His words were cut short as the car door slammed shut, muffling his continued threats and protests. The street fell into a heavy silence. Neighbors whispered among themselves, their faces pale with shock at what they'd witnessed. Some looked ashamed, clearly. They had suspected something, but had chosen to look the other way. The officers took detailed statements, their pens scratching against notepads as they documented years of hidden abuse. John gave a clear, straightforward account of what they'd observed and heard. Dwayne stood nearby, arms folded, his eyes never leaving Ellie as she found the courage to speak her truth. When it was her turn, Ellie's voice shook at first, but as she spoke, she grew stronger. She described the bruises, the hunger, the nights of terror. She talked about her mother's tears, her mother's fear, and the gradual escalation that had ended in tragedy. As the words poured out, it was as if a weight was lifting from her shoulders. Tears streaked her cheeks, but for the first time, she wasn't holding them back in silence. She was finally telling the truth, and adults were listening, believing her, taking action. When she finished, the officer knelt again, her voice quiet but firm. "You did the right thing, Ellie. You're safe now. We'll make sure of it." John placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "See, you're not alone anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes wet but filled with something that had been missing for far too long, hope. The red and blue lights faded from the street as the police cruiser disappeared around the corner, carrying away the man who had terrorized Ellie for far too long. Porch lights blinked off one by one as neighbors slowly retreated to their homes, leaving whispered conversations and guilty consciences in their wake. The night air felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a suffocating weight had been lifted from the entire neighborhood. On the front steps of the Cena house, under the warm glow of the porch light, John, Dwayne, and Ellie remained. The girl's hand was still in John's, small and cold, her shoulders wrapped in the blanket the officers had provided. She kept glancing toward the dark silhouette of the house next door, as if expecting the nightmare to restart, as if the past few hours might dissolve like a cruel dream. "It's over," John said softly, following her gaze. "You don't have to look back anymore." Ellie didn't answer immediately. Her breathing was still shallow and uneven, her eyes red-rimmed from crying and exhaustion. She looked older than any child should ever have to look, yet smaller than any heart should have to bear. Dwayne lowered himself onto the step beside her, giving her space, while still forming a protective circle around her. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The maple tree at the curb rustled its leaves in the gentle breeze. Somewhere far off, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The town was slowly returning to its normal rhythms, but nothing would ever be quite the same. Footsteps creaked across the hallway inside. The front door opened, and John's parents stepped into the light. His mother wore a soft robe tied neatly at the waist. His father had pulled a sweater over his white t-shirt, moving with the careful economy of a man who had been woken from sleep, understood there was trouble, and decided to meet it with steady hands. "John," his mother began, her voice low with concern. "Is everyone dash?" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Ellie, taking in the blanket, the trembling, the way John's hand wrapped protectively around the girl's fingers. The question became unnecessary. She came down the steps until she was level with them, the porch light catching the natural gentleness in her weathered face. "Sweetheart," she said to Ellie, careful not to reach out uninvited, "may I sit?" Ellie nodded without looking up, and John's mother settled onto the step beside them. She didn't force conversation or false cheer. She simply waited with the patience of someone who understood that time itself could be medicine. John's father stood a step above, arms crossed for warmth rather than judgment. He looked at John, then at Dwayne, then back at the girl, reading the story without needing all the details. "You're safe on this porch," he said quietly, his voice carrying the measured certainty of a man who meant every word. "And you're safe in this house." Something in Ellie's posture loosened a fraction, like a knot beginning to untangle after months of being pulled tight. Her eyes tracked the shadows on the sidewalk, then slowly climbed to meet John's mother's kind gaze. "Is it okay if I sit inside?" she asked, the words halting and careful, as if speech itself might somehow cause harm. "Of course it's okay," John's mother replied without hesitation. "Would you like some tea, or just water? I can warm a cup with honey. It helps settle worried minds." Ellie hesitated, then whispered, "Water." "Water it is," John's mother said warmly. "Come when you're ready. There's no rushing here." She disappeared into the glow of the hallway, leaving the door open as an invitation that didn't require an immediate answer. Ellie looked to John as if asking permission to accept kindness, a heartbreaking reminder of how controlled her life had been. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. "We'll be right with you," he promised. She stood on unsteady legs, the blanket slipping from one shoulder. Dwayne caught it before it could fall and gently draped it back around her like a protective cape. "There," he said, his voice warm but even. "Every hero needs one." For the first time since they'd met her, a flicker of something that might become a smile touched the corner of her mouth. It didn't reach her eyes yet, but it existed, and in that moment, existence was enough. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. Family photos climbed the walls. John in his Little League uniform, school concerts with crooked bow ties, Thanksgiving tables overflowing with plates and reaching hands. It was an anthology of ordinary blessings, the kind of normal life Ellie had never known. John's mother returned with a glass of water and a folded hand towel, setting both on the coffee table. She turned on a floor lamp instead of the harsh overhead light, warming the room without startling anyone. "Sit anywhere you like," she said gently. "Couch, chair, floor. My house has no rules about where comfort lives." Ellie chose the edge of the couch, still perched as though ready to flee if necessary. She took the glass with both hands and sipped slowly. John's mother adjusted a throw pillow and nudged a box of tissues closer without comment, then settled in the armchair opposite, close enough to help, far enough not to crowd. "I'll set up the back room," John's father said quietly. "Fresh sheets." He glanced at Ellie, making sure his words included her without singling her out. "It's quiet back there. Good for resting." As he moved down the hallway, each footstep was a promise, preparing, providing, protecting. Ellie sipped again, slower now, and set the glass carefully on the towel. She placed her palms flat on her knees, as though bracing herself against memory's undertow. "It's still so loud," she said suddenly, surprising herself with her own voice. "Even when it's quiet." "I know," John's mother answered with the understanding that comes from having weathered her own storms. "Sometimes quiet is the loudest thing there is. It won't always be that way." Ellie nodded, and 2 more tears slid down her cheeks. She didn't apologize for them, and no one asked her to. In this house, tears were allowed to exist without explanation or shame. When John's father returned, he paused in the doorway. "Room's ready," he said simply. "Cotton sheets, the soft ones. There's a small lamp by the window. If you get cold, pull up the blanket. If you get warm, kick it off. Nobody here gets in trouble for sleeping however feels right." Ellie looked at him uncertainly, unaccustomed to such simple permissions. "Can I keep the light on?" she asked, a thread of fear woven through the request. "You can keep 10 lights on if you want," he said gently. "We'll sort it out in the morning." John's mother rose, pausing without reaching out. "Would you like me to walk you back?" she asked. "Or would you prefer to go with John, or Dwayne, or by yourself? All those choices are yours." Ellie's eyes drifted to John. "With John," she whispered. "Okay," he said, standing and waiting until she was ready to move with him. They walked side by side down the hallway, while Dwayne stayed behind with John's parents, their voices falling into the low murmur of adults reorganizing the world so it could heal. The back room was small and square, a space that had been a study, then a guest room, then a place where memories and hope took turns. Tonight it was a harbor. The bedspread was plain and soft, the lampshade butter-colored, the window blind lowered but not shut tight, leaving a friendly sliver of streetlight along the sill. John stopped at the doorway. "I'll stay right here," he said, "right outside. If you need anything, water, another blanket, a different pillow, just say my name. I'll hear you." Ellie stepped to the side of the bed and touched the blanket with the back of her fingers, as if testing whether it might burn her. She lifted the corner carefully, not with greed but with wonder. "It smells like soap," she said, almost smiling. "Not like anything else." "My mom washes them too much," John said lightly. "She doesn't like dust picking fights in the dark." Ellie climbed onto the mattress with the careful deliberation of someone testing thin ice. She tucked her feet beneath the sheet, then the blanket, and paused with her hands still above the covers. "If I close my eyes," she said quietly, "is it okay if I pretend this is what it was like before, when Mom was still?" "Yes," John answered without hesitation. "It's more than okay." She slid her hands under the blanket and looked toward the door. "Will you be there when I wake up?" "I will," he promised. "And if I have to step away, Dwayne will be there. And if he has to step away, my parents will be there. You won't be alone. Not for 1 minute." Her breath shivered once, then steadied. She looked around the room, memorizing each detail: lamp, curtain, chair, John in the doorway. Evidence that safety could exist. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not leaving." "I won't," he said firmly. "Good night, Ellie." "Good night," she whispered back. John stayed until her breathing lengthened into the slow rhythm that meant her body had decided to try peace. He remained 3 beats longer, because sometimes vigilance is just another word for love. Then he eased the door nearly closed, because a sliver of light can be its own kind of promise. Back in the living room, Dwayne had joined John's parents at the kitchen table. Empty mugs sat between them, their steam long gone. No one was asking the questions whose answers could wait for daylight. No one was rushing toward plans that might make the present feel conditional. "How is she?" John's mother asked quietly. "Asleep," John said. "Or close enough." They sat together in comfortable silence, the house settling into its role as sanctuary. At some point, John's father disappeared and returned with a small nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. He handed it to John without ceremony. "For the outlet by the floor," he said. "Sometimes light needs to happen low." John took it back down the hallway and plugged it in where it would cast a gentle glow against the baseboard, proof that darkness wasn't in charge. When he returned, Dwayne was staring at his hands, big and quiet, as if considering all the things they could protect and all the things they couldn't undo. "You did good tonight," John said, settling back into the living room. Dwayne shook his head slowly. "She did good. We just stood where we needed to stand." John's mother folded a blanket over the back of the couch, her movements gentle but purposeful. "She'll need time," she said, "and patience, and people who won't disappear when things get difficult." "She'll have all of that," John said with quiet certainty. Near midnight, Ellie stirred and called John's name once, not in panic, just confirmation that the promise still held. He answered from the couch. "I'm here." The sigh that followed told him her body was learning to trust rest again. Around 2 in the morning, she called again, softer. He answered again. The third time never came. Just before dawn, when the sky hadn't yet committed to morning, John's mother returned with toast and jam on a small plate, setting it on the coffee table as if breakfast should be allowed to arrive early and wait patiently for its moment. When daylight finally crept through the blinds, thin and tentative, Ellie appeared in the hallway. The blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, her hair mussed from real sleep, her eyes swollen but clearer than they'd been in months. "Good morning," John's mother said, as if the phrase had never been in danger. Ellie stood at the threshold for a moment, then took 3 careful steps into the room. She looked at each face turned toward her, John, Dwayne, his parents, not interrogators or saviors, just people who had decided her life would happen in a circle she didn't have to leave. "We've been talking," John's father said gently, then paused and tried again with fewer words. "You can stay here." Ellie blinked, the sentence too large to process on the first attempt. "As long as you want," John's mother added. "Tonight, tomorrow, next week, until the path ahead makes sense and feels safe. We'll help you find it." "Even if I wake up scared?" Ellie asked, her voice small. "Even if you wake up scared," John's mother confirmed. "Even if I don't want the lights off." "Even if you don't want the lights off," John's father said. "Even if you change your mind about what helps." Dwayne added. John leaned forward, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Even if all you can do today is breathe. We're not going anywhere." The smallest sound escaped Ellie's throat. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a lock recognizing a new key. Tears came, but they arrived as visitors, not invaders. She wiped them away and didn't apologize. "Thank you," she said, her words steady for the first time. "I don't have anywhere else." "You do now," John's mother said simply. They didn't rush to orchestrate the moment into something performative. John's mother set the toast within reach. John's father adjusted the blinds to let in gentler morning light. Dwayne found a clean sweatshirt from John's teenage years and placed it on the arm of the chair, not insisting, just making warmth available. Ellie reached for the toast and took a small bite. The simplest act in the world became ceremony, grain and warmth, and a body allowed to be hungry without punishment. "Do you like your toast with a lot of jam or a little?" John's mother asked. Ellie considered this carefully, then spread a thin, precise layer. "A little," she decided. "Then a little it is," John's mother said, as if a constitution had been written. Morning arrived fully. The town's familiar sounds returned, garbage trucks, school buses, a neighbor sweeping steps. Inside the house, the day arranged itself around the girl in the armchair and the new definition of family she had been invited to test. John caught Dwayne's eye across the coffee table. Neither smiled broadly. Relief doesn't always look like celebration. Sometimes it looks like a man finally able to lean back into support, or like a girl taking a second bite of toast. Ellie finished eating, set the plate down, and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders again. She looked at John's mother with something approaching wonder. "Can I help with something?" she asked. "I can fold things or carry things." She stopped, searching for words. "You can be a child," John's mother said gently. "That's help enough." Later, when the sun found the back room and warmed the cotton sheets, when the house had learned to accommodate one more heartbeat, when the dark house next door was just architecture and not a sentence, Ellie would sleep again and wake again. She would begin mapping rooms where safety lived. For now, she sat with the people who had found her signal for help and refused to walk away. The nightmare was over. The healing could begin. "Do you want to see the garden?" John's father asked quietly. "The tulips are just starting to get ideas about spring." Ellie considered this invitation to hope. "Maybe after," she said. "I think I want to sit here just a little longer." "As long as you like," he replied, and meant it completely. Outside, the world continued its ancient rhythms. But inside this house, something new had taken root. A family expanded by choice rather than chance, bound together not by blood but by the simple, revolutionary decision that every child deserves safety, and that sometimes heroes come disguised as neighbors who refuse to look away when someone signals for help. The truth had been spoken. The silence had been broken. And for the first time in far too long, a little girl named Ellie could close her eyes and believe that tomorrow would be better than yesterday.